Welcome back, legends. I hope you're all amazing. We've got another Q&A today. This one is powered by my amazing supporters over at Patreon. They submitted a bunch of questions that I cannot wait to get into. If you'd like to become a patron to get access to some exclusive content, to participate in these patron-only Q&As, and a whole bunch of other stuff, it is linked in the video description along with my blocks library for fractal devices, my free IR, and the music I make with my band Ragdoll. Let's go. Let's get started with what may be considered a highly specific and slightly nerdy question, but I love it nonetheless. Volume control feel on your guitar. Do you have volume controls that are maybe a little bit too stiff or a little bit too loose? And is there a sweet spot? I think there definitely is a sweet spot, but I think that sweet spot is pretty wide. I really notice if a volume control is way too hard to turn or way too loose to turn, but I don't notice it when it's kind of good. That's what makes me think there is quite a wide sweet spot. This Strat that I've recently put some Fralin pickups in came with a loaded pick guard, and the volume control on it is a little bit stiff on there. Like, I do that and it only comes up at about halfway. If I do the same thing on my PV Wolfgang, you can hear that little click on there. It goes all the way up, maybe a little bit too quick. This one is kind of loose and it is very easy to bump it out of place. I think my favorite though is probably the volume control on my new CE24. This one, you can give it a good spin and it will click in there, but you can also be more sensitive with it and it just kind of goes where you want it to go. This is fairly easy to remedy. I remember getting some advice from a friend who was working in a music store when I was in high school. I actually did work experience with them. They were absolutely awesome. And they said, you know, Leon, you want a good noise gate? Go and buy one of these DiMarzio pots, the kind of speed pots on there, because then that way you can be playing away and just get into the habit of turning your volume control down when you're not playing, and you'll have way less noise. And those pots, I think, and a lot of people would probably agree, are tuned just right. Sometimes you get a cheap pot and it feels really crackly, and you know, for me, I do work the volume control a lot, not necessarily like turning it up or down, but just turning it all the way off. So having it responsive and again in that pretty wide sweet spot is important. It's funny though, because I definitely need to change the volume pot on my PRS DGT. I think I've just worked it so much as is. It's starting to get like a little bit sticky feeling in there. Having said all of that, I'd be really curious to know what everybody's preference is. Do you like maybe a volume pot that has a bit of resistance in there so that when you move it, it really stays where you want it? Or do you like the kind of speedy Wolfgang style pots that I've got on here? Let me know in the comments. Stacked compression on the Axe effects. These tricks should work whether you're using the Fractal or any other modeler that has an adjustable compressor type in it, or of course with real pedals. And they are great settings for playing slide, primarily inspired by Lowell George from Little Feat, who would stack together a few compressors, namely the 1176, a studio comp. So companies like Origin Effects have put out pedals like the Cali 76 stacked and the Slide Rig, which let you do this in one pedal. Of course, if you're on a Fractal, you can run multiple compressors. So these settings are taken from Austin Buddy, basically two studio feedback compressors running in series. I've got the threshold at -30, the ratio at 4, the attack time at 0.283 milliseconds, and the release time at 75 milliseconds on both. The first compressor, I'm bumping the level by about 3 dB, and the second compressor, I'm bumping the level by 6 dB to hit the front of the amp harder. So let's hear this on a Strat bridge pickup. I'll bring in the first comp and then the second comp. You do get a little bit of distortion. You're using it as a boost to hit the front of the amp harder, and you're also getting a whole lot of extra sustain. So I'm brave enough to torture you all here with some slide playing. Let's just have a listen to maybe playing the slide on this guitar that's set up in standard tuning, and then I'll kick both comps in. Gear that I am yet to try that I would absolutely love to. There is so much, right? I've tried so much gear over the years. There are thousands of videos on my channel now, and I've spent even more time going through different amps, pedals, and guitars in the time that I'm not filming myself and putting it up on YouTube. But there are still some pieces of gear that I would absolutely love to try. There's the standard holy grail instruments, right? A real 59 Les Paul, a real 1954 Strat. I would love to try out an original Steinberger and an original Parker Fly. They're guitars I have never had my hands on, the real deal, just because similar to the 54 Strat or the 59 Les Paul, they're pretty important in the development of the electric guitar. There's a bunch of modern instruments that I would love to try. I'd love to try out, say, an Aristides. I think they just look so cool. They look like sports cars, and having my Rubato Lassie, which is carbon fiber and so easy to play. I just love to try more instruments that use, say, less traditional wood-based methods of construction on there. So there's a few instruments, and then plenty of amps that I would love to try. Being an SRV fan, I'd love to try an original Vibroverb or some equivalent, clone that's made, just because I want to see what the big deal is all about and how it differs to, say, a deluxe or a twin amps that I have played. And then, of course, there's vintage Marshalls and vintage Boogies. A real 2C Plus is something I would love to get my hands on. I've got a great Mark IV and I've got a Studio Pre, so I imagine it will be pretty close, but still, when you're playing the real deal, sometimes it just puts you in a particular space that maybe opens you up to the so-called magic or perceived magic of these pieces of gear, like playing my good friend Troy Naberband's 77 Marshall JMP for the first time was an amazing experience. I had never played an amp from that era, and it just had the sound, which is one of the reasons why I went and bought a vintage 70s Marshall recently. More about that later, though. So yeah, there's still loads of pieces of gear that I would love to try out, and going on the sort of rack gear odyssey that I've been on over the last couple of years, getting to try units like the 2290 and the H3000 and experiencing why so many people love them, and also experiencing maybe some of the downsides of those and why those units were eventually replaced by other units and how it inspired current pieces of gear. Like looking at something like an Axe-Fx, you can see the way the design has, say, kind of naturally evolved from something like the Roland GP100, the TC Electronics G-Force and Fireworks into the first generation Axe-Fx, the way it's picked up features from other units and user requests in there. It's very, very interesting, and I do like that gear history element. And you should all let me know, what is a holy grail piece of gear that you want to try? What's on your bucket list? Here's a question from longtime supporter Rutger. Do I think Ragdoll will ever play shows on other continents? And is touring even financially viable for an independent act like us? It's an excellent question. It's something we've been chatting about, obviously, since the last time we went overseas. I'll give you a little insight into how we've been able to do so much touring, basically as a band that does everything themselves. We don't have a record deal or a publishing deal or management. We have been fortunate to be invited to some fantastic festivals overseas, and we've been able to build tours around that. But essentially, we're really fortunate here in Western Australia, where we can play a lot of regional shows, we can do corporate shows, we can play at places like mine sites, and we can do gigs that, compared to the rest of the world, are fairly well paid. And for a long time, we have set that money that we make on the gigs aside so that we can pump it back into the band, whether it is paying for our own recordings, whether it is paying for promotion and publicists like we've done on a bunch of tours before, whether it is putting all that money aside and using it as a tour fund so that we can pay for our flights, so that we can pay for hotels and accommodation, putting fuel in the car, doing all the upfront costs of printing merch, printing vinyl, printing CDs, all the things that will make you money on the road, you have to shell out for in advance. And the last US tour we did, we were pretty fortunate where we were able to sell enough merch where at the end of it, we pretty much broke even. And that was the goal that I wanted to get to when I started playing music. I wanted the experience of going out on the road. And, you know, if we never made any money, that was totally cool. A mark of success would be that maybe we'd break even on a tour, and we were able to do that. I think the thing for us, which I'm so fortunate to have experienced, is that by doing that and putting the money we were making, doing cover gigs and regional shows here and our original shows in town and pumping it all back into the band and the brand, is that I've never had to dip into my own pocket when we're going on tour. We're able to say yes more often than bands if it's a case of there's 3 of us and we'd all have to be shelling out of our own pockets. You know, if we weren't doing the covers thing, we weren't doing the corporate and regional thing, that just wouldn't have been feasible with 3 people who have their own families and their own lives going on. So in that regard, we've been super fortunate. Having said that, because we've done that, I think we will play some shows outside of Australia, hopefully sooner rather than later, but it is a case of planning it out. And being from Perth just adds an extra layer of complexity to that. We went and did Glamfest in Melbourne recently, which happened to be on the same weekend that Taylor Swift was in Melbourne. So hotels were super expensive. Flights were super expensive. Just trying to find hotels and flights was difficult as it was. But we went over, we had an amazing gig. We got to play in front of more people than we've played in at an original show in Perth for so long. And the bonus is we get to catch up with all our mates in Melbourne, play with other bands, network, just hang out and watch our favorite bands like Lynch Mob and Slaughter and Taiketo and bands I would never get to see because they wouldn't be coming to Perth. I'm really curious for anyone who is in a band who's watching this video, what difficulties have you run into recently when it comes to touring? Is the cost just really becoming unfeasible? Because like I said, the last couple of tours we've done, they've been expensive, they've been worthwhile, but from a pure cost perspective, compared to doing it 10 years ago, it is so much more expensive. And I can see why so many bands are just simply choosing not to tour and maybe doing their live sets on YouTube or just releasing more music on Bandcamp and kind of going that way where they still are in charge of their product, but they're just going about the way they're making music slightly differently. Really curious to hear from you all in the comments below. One last question for this week. This comes from friend of the channel, Roger from Rubato Guitars. Roger's in the middle of making an 8-string multi-scale guitar out of carbon fiber and wants to find a trem system for it. And Roger, I have to say, I think you've totally stumped me here. I have absolutely no idea where to begin with this one. So I feel like maybe we should just throw it out to the community. What can people recommend for this sort of setup? Again, 8 strings, multi-scale, and a trem that would work on a guitar. I'm guessing as well you'd want a fairly low profile system on there as well without a very big block, because I imagine the guitar's not going to be super thick in that case. I'm pretty excited to see what it ends up being as well, Roger. If there's a solution that you can buy and install, that's going to be pretty awesome. And if not, and you have to come up with your own trem system, I love what you guys did with the 0 fret and string guide and the pickup mounting on the Rubato Lassie. So I'd be kind of curious to see what you would do if you had to design a multi-scale trem from scratch. That seems like, you know, if if all the things I mentioned were like Mount Kilimanjaro, then the 8-string multi-scale trem is Mount Everest when it comes to gear. But there may already be a solution. I'm just not aware of it. So anyone watching this, let me know in the comment section below. And again, a big shout out to Roger and the team at Rubato. They make some amazing instruments, and I was lucky enough to actually catch up with Roger when he was here in Perth a couple of months ago, and we had a pretty wicked time. So let me know in the comments. That is it for this week. Thank you to all my amazing patrons who submitted questions. If you would like to submit a question for the next Q&A, or you would like to become a patron, there are links to my Patreon and the music that I make with my band Ragdoll in the video description. Leave a comment, you know, let me know how you would go about designing or maybe buying an 8-string multi-scale trem. Let me know how you go about putting together, say, a rig around a modeler and a digital mixer where you can just plug and play with backing tracks. And like I said earlier, let me know what your dream piece of gear to try is that you are yet to try out. I will see you all on the next Q&A. Have a fantastic week. Be good to one another. I'll see you next time.